Welcome back to TechBio Talks, where we explore bold ideas, breakthrough technologies, and visionary people reshaping the future of AI in medicine. Our guest today is a physician, an innovator, and an executive who has helped shape the modern field of real-world evidence across academia, industry, and government. She helped pioneer oncology real-world data at Flatiron Health, advance large-scale data and technology platforms at Verily as their CMO, and helped establish one of my favorite parts about Amy, and there are many, the FDA's early frameworks for real-world evidence and data monetization as Principal Deputy Commissioner of the agency. Now, as co-founder of Highlander Health, she's focused on advancing evidence generation and addressing systemic gaps in patient care and access. Please join me in welcoming the incomparable and the illustrious Dr. Amy Abernethy. Amy, welcome to the show.
So good to see you. Hi, Najat, and it's great to be here.
Thank you so much for making the time today. So I have a bunch of questions. We're going to rip through them, but please feel free to take the conversation in any way that you want. So first step, which is a question we get from a lot of people. You help shape real-world evidence, across Flatiron, FDA, Verily, and many major industry collaborations. Few people have really seen this entire arc the way that you have. Can you help our audience understand what are we talking about here? What defines real-world evidence? How do we make sense of it? And how does it contribute to getting a medicine to patients better and faster?
First of all, a little definitional approach to thinking about real-world data and real-world evidence. Really, what we're talking about is making maximal use of the data that already exists as a byproduct of the delivery of healthcare. Now, interestingly, we have had an evolving set of definitions over the years for real-world data and real-world evidence. But, you can think about the 20 years ago plus definition of real-world data, where really what we were talking about is data that existed often in claims data sets and in the kinds of data sets that were predominantly structured and voluminous, representing administrative data. Then we came to wave 2 of real-world data, which was the data coming from the electronic health record that could be paired with claims data in the EHR plus claims data and other data sets coming along during that period of 2, like patient-reported outcomes. What we saw was that some of the data were high quality and easy to work with, and other data were kind of trapped. So living in the PDFs of the electronic health record, the digital paper. And part of the task in Wave 2 were developing scalable, high-quality approaches to take data that lives in the medical case note, for example, and now start to complete that in a way that's structured and analyzable. And now we're in Wave 3. And what's interesting about Wave 3 of the real-world data space is it's grown both in breadth, depth, and longitudinality. So what we're seeing now in this most recent wave is indeed we can take data that exists as a byproduct of healthcare, so all the data types we were talking about up until now, but actually pair it with new data types. For example, now we're starting to see real-world data incorporate genomics information, medical imaging, retinal imaging, many different data types. So now we're starting to talk about real-world multimodal data. Also a new feature of the real-world data of 2026 is that it is both retrospective and prospective. It represents data that already existed and then also can be paired with new data collection going forward. So what you're seeing is these sort of hybrid models of real-world data. Now, you asked a lot of questions about what can we do with real-world data, but before we go to that, one other aspect. You've noticed I kept saying real-world data, not real-world evidence.
Yeah.
When it gets analyzed, for example, according to a specified protocol, then it starts to generate information that we can call real-world evidence. And the reliability and quality of that information is really dependent on the quality of the underlying data and the specificity of the protocol. So that's kind of that difference between real-world data and real-world evidence.
That was incredibly helpful. I remember you and I having conversation a few years back in terms of when can we get some of the omics data incorporated? When can we get some of the sensory or even histopath data? And also the longitudinality, I think, is one of the areas that's been a challenge from a data quality and data completeness perspective when you're trying to use it for various applications, right? Whether it's in discovery, trying to connect the dots between what you're seeing in the lab for to patient outcomes, and all the way to even precision medicine and patient stratification in development, which is a very critical part of what a lot of drug developers do. So I guess the question, as you look at the different arcs, the kind of uses of real world data and evidence have evolved. What are you seeing as the full spectrum? Where do you see much more proof points to date? And where would you wish that we can do more work going forward? So just maybe a translation also from a value and impact perspective.
So it's interesting. I first of all, I think about the landscape of real world data and real world evidence as having a number of different types of tasks. So one task is basically telling the story of what has been. So the use of real world data to tell us about natural history of disease, to look at the comparison of patients' experience, for example, with safety and effectiveness outcomes on drug A versus drug B from a retrospective perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, now thinking about how do we use real world data and real world evidence to plan for the future? So using real world data to, for example, plan your clinical trial or identify high quality sites for running your clinical trial or identifying the patients who are eligible for the clinical
Yep.
trial. So lots of opportunities in the planning. Then there's the roles of real world data and evidence as we think about how we can now use these data sets for really remarkable new tasks. So you sort of mentioned, for example, in the drug discovery side. So how can you imagine drug discovery, AI-based drug discovery, for example, that combines deep biologic information with deep clinical phenotype information to try and identify new targets, new biology, for example? Or how do we use these data sets now to complete our clinical trial data set? This is one of my favorite examples. When we run, for example, a phase 3 clinical trial, 30 to 50% of that information already exists in the medical record. If we can generate high quality data from the data that already exists, we can repurpose it to complete the study data set and reduce the documentation burden in our phase 3 studies in a meaningful way. So the landscape of real world data and evidence has really widened quite dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years. The use cases are interesting, but we've got a lot of methodological work to do underneath the hood to be able to have confidence in the results that we're seeing.
Again, a lot of the times people will say real world data, it's really observational health called a different name, and it's not really that different. But I love how you've explained the evolution of the data and the evidence frameworks. When you look at, for instance, whether it's novel target tied to the translatability in a patient, which is really important when you're looking at novel targets, or even things like patient stratification, designing a study better. Like, how often do we design a study and then we keep rechanging the study because you didn't design to fit the patient in mind? I mean, how do you make it much more patient-centric? When you look at all of that and you look across the landscape of pharma and tech bio and biotech, are people really making moves to invest in the space, to pilot things, to do things at scale? And I'm asking this because there's always everybody wants to, but then they'll say, well, the data isn't good enough. Well, the regulatory frameworks, the FDA will say no. I mean, you've seen the entirety of the arc. So just some thoughts in terms of how much are people leaning in to just try? It's not always going to work, but truly leaning in to test it out.
It's interesting. I've seen remarkable change in the last 5 years. I would say that 10 years ago, most of the real world data, real world evidence conversation was what I called the replacement product for clinical trials, where essentially what pharma sponsors or real world data researchers and others were trying to do is figure out how could we leverage analyses of real world data to now kind of create a totality of the evidence package and reduce our need to do some kind of the clinical trial task. Now, in 2026, there is now a complete shift in what I'm seeing in the leveraging of real world data to it being a strategic task all the way across the preclinical development and clinical development landscape. And it's interesting how I've seen that shift show up. So first of all, what I have seen is that I'm talking way more frequently to the chief scientific officers, chief development officers, and other senior leaders in pharma, whereas I used to spend most of my time talking to med affairs and legal. And that seems like an interesting shift.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
It's also, I think, been an interesting shift that a pharma company's data strategy is now core to scientific strategy. And that includes the real world data set strategy and the real world reuse. And how is that going to show up all the way across
Yeah.
your clinical development space? So that feels quite different as a shift. Also, similarly, there's always been the conversation about the role of real world data and evidence to support essentially payer conversations, HTA, et cetera. But now that conversation is moving way upstream. How do we plan for the data elements that we need in our data sets earlier in clinical development? So we've got those data there, including in our real world data assets that we're going to use post-market to try and make sure that we are creating a complete story. One other thing that I think is shifting this. If somebody were to ask me, I suspect they would think I would say that the major shift was regulators being willing to talk about, consider, and think about what good looks like in the context of real world data and evidence. Yes, that's really important, but regulators are going to appropriately be skeptical when the data quality is not there. But what we saw was regulatory guidance that was quite clear about the importance of, for example, data linkage to deal with data gaps and missingness, the importance of data curation to deal with data that existed in unstructured documents or other data errors in the data set. And so what we've seen is a focus on improving the quality of the underlying data itself, documenting, developing new approaches to continuously improve on it. And that is really what's making many of these use cases possible, as well as the fact that as we've had now multimodal data where the data are inclusive of imaging and omics and retinal, now the core use cases on the drug discovery and early development side are also now coming into focus.
I think that's such an important point. And, it's something you said around, your data strategy becomes core to your asset strategy, your clinical strategy, the core strategy of the entire company. It takes a lot of pre-planning. Like if you think about, even before you go into the clinic, you want to have a good understanding. We're using it. My team is using it in our target product profile way early in discovery to really understand which patients would benefit from the novel biological insight that we see. And then if you think about the compound, really layering on top of that access and adoption. So by the time you're in the clinic, you have a fairly good idea of who your end user, customer is. And, it seems such an obvious thing to say, like, wow, study without that, but that's not how things have been. The second piece that you mentioned is the multimodality is actually allowing you to do forward and reverse validation and understanding of science, biology, and just patient outcomes. I guess a question for you, in terms of regulators and engaging with them, there has been some new guidance, but I've always found it that, as sponsors, we need to lead the way in terms of really having high quality evidence. It can be supplemental to whatever you have in your clinical trial, but really leading the way and engaging early through pre-specification discussions and so forth. What are your thoughts on that? And also you mentioned a little bit about novel approaches or new, analysis approaches that you'd love to dig in on. I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well.
FDA and regulators around the world have, worked hard to build a suite of guidances to start to tell the story of here's what we'd expect. But the reality is you can't write guidance in a vacuum. That first you need example use cases that start to depict what does good look like. And that allows for regulators to say, I trust this, I don't trust that. Here's what we think you should do. And as you mentioned, for example, as a sponsor, being forward-footed about new study designs, study planning, having the pre-specification conversation with the regulators to say, what do you think? And doing that work together is very helpful. I would say the other thing that I have observed, both inside and outside, is being proactive about participating in a number of different forums where you can actually showcase your work. We developed this program called the Evidence Accelerator when I was at FDA, where tech companies, data holders, researchers, pharma sponsors, and really pretty much the entire community could now come together with FDA, CDC, other others in HHS to explore the role of real-world data and evidence for the management. What was interesting was these very rapid cycle meetings as the Evidence Accelerator gave FDA the chance to say, interesting, fascinating how we can use real-world data for supply chain management, fascinating how we can think about the role of real-world data to tell the natural history of COVID. All of that now helped really move things along, both for the management of the pandemic, but also to build regulatory familiarity with what's possible. And the more that sponsors and others can lean into the kinds of activities that provide the opportunity to build regulatory familiarity, whether that is with Highlander Health or Friends of Cancer Research or Duke Margolis or Reagan-Udall Foundation or other opportunities, it's actually also an opportunity to bring regulators along about how you're thinking.
So that's a perfect segue into sort of the next area. You founded Highlander Health, and it's fantastic. I remember seeing the news, and of course, I was like, Amy is going to do it her way and create something that really doesn't exist in this industry. For those that are listening, it's a very unique two-pronged strategy, right? So you have a for-profit partners arm to invest, from what I understand, and you also have a philanthropic institute to run learning labs. Just tell us behind the scenes, why did you decide that this model was most effective in driving change? I mean, you've seen a lot, so there's a lot we can learn from. And how does this dual institute partners model work together to generate evidence, improve operations in hospitals, and really cut down the timelines and improve the quality of development and access?
I co-founded Highlander Health with my colleague Brad Hirsch not quite 2 years ago, really with this core focus of how do we dramatically accelerate clinical research timelines so that medical products that are safe and effective can get to patients that need them, full stop. It also is in line with the thesis that we need evidence and also longitudinal data to support personalization in healthcare. So that's kind of the underlying thesis of Highlander Health. As you mentioned, we've got two parts. We have Highlander Health Institute, where we give grants to health systems and others to test out ideas that have been talked about for a long time, but just still haven't really taken hold. And the question is, why not? What's it going to take to get from here to there? The other part of Highlander Health is what we call Highlander Health Partners. And there we invest, these are corporate investments in companies that we think are a part of the modern clinical research and personalized healthcare infrastructure of the future, where the thesis of our investments is that through both capital and elbow grease, we can actually start to move this story forward. Why two parts of the story? Why the nonprofit side and the commercial investing side? Practically speaking, on the nonprofit side, there are some problems that need to be solved where higher waters float to all boats, and everybody needs the answers to these questions. That's why we call them learning laboratories, and the participants look like health systems and tech companies and regulators. You'll notice that there's a flavor that shows up from what we learned in the Evidence Accelerator. Then on the corporate side, that actually allows us to practice underneath the hood and get it right to build the technology for this modern future at scale. On the Highlander Health Partner side of the equation, about a year ago, we announced our first acquisition of a company called Target RWE. Target is a longitudinal data company. You notice longitudinality, that's one of my key areas of focus. A longitudinal data company in the liver disease, dermatology, and gastroenterology space. Why did we invest? So first of all, Target has deep relationships with health systems. One of the areas of focus at Highlander Health is the importance of those relationships with health systems, doctors, patients, how the healthcare gets delivered. Another reason that we focused on Target is a focus on data quality, data curation, and getting to these longitudinal data sets. And then the last and maybe most important reason we focused on Target was because, as you've already heard, I think that the future is about pairing data that already exists with prospective new data collection, that you can run a number of different study types. And that's one of the things that had already started to be sort of developed in the Target RWE story. And we really want to amplify that in the future.
Yeah, actually, I love this model. I was thinking about it, for Target RWE, actually partnered with them in a prior life. It was very challenging in chronic diseases specifically to find really good longitudinal data that exists. And so much of that requires deep partnerships with the hospital systems and so forth, that trust that needs to exist. So I think that's going to be huge for a lot of the disease areas, right? And Amy, remember 5 years ago, it was all around personalized medicines in certain areas. And now there's been an opening of chronic diseases, both of which great news for patients. And so much of understanding the patient journey will probably help us be able to desegment or subsegment these diseases further to their real components, which again helps to the personalization for patients that are waiting. So I can totally see where you're going, and I love the uniqueness of the model.
Very excited about this. You know, as a clinician, as a person who's spent a lot of time in the tech industry, as a person who's spent time at FDA, as a parent and patient myself,
Yeah.
I really think that part of the way, or a huge part of the way that we get there is to bring the development side and the care delivery side more closely together so that they're informing each other.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you've said this for years, and you're a pioneer in even starting that at Flatiron, and then Verily, and then of course all of the different FDA, and now Highlander Health. So I can't wait to see more of that because that is something that's top of mind for me every single day. You know, if you could close that gap, it would have a huge impact on so many companies and the whole sector as all. Okay, one more question. Zooming out for a second, you mentioned a little bit about AI as well. You're looking at the broader environment and ecosystem. You've had a front row at the seismic shifts that's happening in healthcare. You know, from the exponential growth of AI, LLMs, and clinical applications. You know, you and I were both at Health this year as an example, and it was great to actually hear about the adoption of a lot of this by clinicians and so forth. A long way still to go. Just some of the sweeping regulatory changes that are happening in terms of modern technologies and approaches, balancing that comment with, and it's very different to have guidance at the top level, but actually cascading that and ensuring that's being utilized at a division level with its regulators, that still takes some time. So we're in that inflection point, I feel. Do you see AI making any near-term contributions to evidence generation already made, where there's more to do? Any perspectives on that? And maybe what is one stubborn constraint that you wish if you had a magic wand you could remove?
You know, it's interesting. AI and evidence generation. At first blush, you'd say, "Oh, but this is not an AI story." But of course, it's an AI story, right? So when I think about AI and evidence generation, I first ask the question, where is AI going to help us be smarter and work faster? So in that context, for example, we were talking a few minutes ago about data curation and the importance of essentially cleaning up the messy clinical data in order to
Yep.
make it useful for all these use cases we've been talking about. And the role of AI to help us with that is critical. However, it isn't just a magic bullet. So we need to do so in very purposeful ways. FDA put forth guidance on how to leverage AI in clinical development about last January. And thinking about how do we thoughtfully apply those 7 steps to data curation is one example of how we can put AI to work for us. Similarly, we can put AI to work for us in the design of studies, so helping us with study design, in helping us with optimizing clinical study designs, and also, for example, optimizing a participant recruitment and optimizing sites. So lots of places in the sort of design and execution of day-to-day activities and clinical research. I think it's fascinating where AI also has a role as we think about these large, longitudinal, complex, multimodal data sets. How do you make sense of it all? This is obviously the place of drug discovery and really remarkable opportunities, but it moves all the way through to how we think about patient stratification and optimization, to how we also think about personalization of care and clinical decision support, and to also how we think about compelling payer narratives. So I think that there is really like the role of artificial intelligence all the way across that. Last thing I would say about AI, and I always think that this is an interesting aspect of the AI and EvGen story, is first of all, AI needs high quality data for algorithm development. And
100%.
then there's an expectation that algorithms that are developed and are going to be applied within the healthcare setting themselves be evaluated. So you need
Yes.
evidence generation to evaluate your algorithms. But the other thing you need to do is monitor the performance of algorithms across time. So you need reliable data sets. They're longitudinal that keep
Mhm.
check of AI algorithms running within the business of medicine and the day-to-day activities of healthcare, let alone also within the context of drug development and discovery. And so there's lots of opportunities to build up that infrastructure as well, both for AI development and also AI evaluation and monitoring. Choke point. There are so many, but I think I would go back to my mantra, which is that AI requires data. And so we always have to go back to our roots of getting our data right.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think that's true for, a lot of models every day, right? You check the news, there's like a new model, there's a new model that's coming through. So much of that is actually generated on public data. The quality, the longitudinality, all of that. But then on top of that, proprietary data also becomes incredibly important. I mean, I think that's where the competitive mode comes from. As one point. The second point I think that you made is really important. In my prior life, having built AI algorithms that are then used in the health system, the monitoring piece is incredibly important to make sure you're using AI for good and it's not drifted. There's a model drift in some way. But it all comes back to the same question. Like, we're still building. And I like to tell people this when they ask me, Najat, why does it take so long in like tech bio, whatever you want to call it, AI and healthcare? The data foundation, high quality, fit for purpose data foundation, didn't really exist. And the last 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, and ongoing is to build that road so you can actually drive the car, which you want to build. Without that infrastructure, we are limited. And it's just so good to hear from you, just that honest evaluation of progress being made and so much more that needs to be done.
Yes. Can I add one additional little thing there,
Of
Najat,
course,
which
please.
is that you mentioned publicly available data and then also internal proprietary data. And, core to data strategy these days is how do you make sure that you can reuse your data maximally and
Yeah,
also combine it maximally? How do
exactly.
you make sure that you have the right permissioning models, the right contracts in place, et cetera? So
Yeah.
core to strategy.
Oh, I totally agree. I remember at one point we had really high quality data, but it was sitting in the walls of the CRO and never even brought into the company. So to your point of like reusable, this is your data, high quality, but doesn't even sit in the four walls. So the building the infrastructure and the making sure you read the contracts to make sure you can get that data, because that was one of the most valuable aspects of building our algorithms. It's gold when you have that kind of high quality data. But it's as much the models, the data compute, as it is just good business sense and the unglamorous grind of figuring
Yes.
out, if I can say it, if that's a term even. So, Amy, it's been so much fun catching up with you. Every time, we've known each other for years, but every time I learn so many different things and also just humbled by so much that you've done for the sector, the space, the world, and so much more you'll do. So, before we wrap up, I just want to give you an opportunity. If there's any one thing that we didn't cover, or you just want the audience to take away, anything you're working on that you want us to keep an eye out for, anything that others are working on, or anything you just want the team to take away and learn from.
So thank you. I would say that watch this space may be a little unglamorous, but actually I think is going to be incredibly foundational, is building the disciplined approaches for curating data like we talked about a few
Yep.
minutes ago. How do we curate data? Leveraging LLMs and other capabilities and do so in ways that external reviewers have confidence in the work. And one of the things you're going to see me very much focus on in the next year is how do we do that in disciplined ways and document that.
Mhm.
And then the other thing is we've talked about retrospective and prospective
Mhm.
study designs. Watch this space because more are coming.
Amazing. The perspective piece is incredibly important, but it's always challenging to connect the two. So the fact that the hybrid systems that you mentioned are coming together, so excited to learn more. Stay tuned with the fantastic Dr. Amy Abernethy. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you, Najat. It was fun.